Good evening, everyone. Happy Tuesday and welcome to our TR Site Tuesday Speaker Series night featuring Ed Patton this evening. Welcome, Ed. We're glad to have you here with us. My name is Spencer Morgan. I'm the Executive Director for the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Site where you are today. Thank you for joining us. I see there's a little snow outside, but we couldn't ask for a nicer day. Just a couple notes, housekeeping wise, if you have questions, please hold until the end. We will bring a microphone over to you so you can ask your question and you'll get an answer from Ed. Those on Zoom, feel free to put your question in the chat box and we will read it aloud for Ed. Okay, I have a bio on Ed, which I'm going to read for you. Ed is a Buffalo native and a longtime resident of Lakeview, New York. One of my neighbors, thank you. Undergraduate and graduate degrees from the institution formerly known as the Canisius College, now Canisius University. Postgraduate studies you did in Ireland. Very nice. Co-founder of Western New York Heritage Institute at Canisius College, now later an independent institute. He is the founder and president of Western New York Heritage Press, founder and first president of Western New York Heritage Magazine, which we do carry in our gift shop. So if you're looking for the current issue, we have it downstairs. He is author and co-author of a number of historical books on Western New York history. He is the co-author of America's Crossroads, Buffalo's Canal Street, Dante Place, The Making of a City, Western New York Heritage Press. We have examples on the table. Also publisher of Canal Water and Whiskey, Marvin Rapp. He is part of Maritime Buffalo, the Waterview Guide to Buffalo Harbor, and he's a feature writer for the Irish Times going on 20 years.
Yeah, is it that one? Okay.
He is a board of trustee member for the Buffalo Lighthouse Society, Western New York Railway Historical Society, Buffalo Irish Genealogical Society, where he was president for a number of years. And he is currently the vice president for development at the Heritage Discovery Center. And on a personal note, I knew Ed back when I started my career. I won't say how long ago, but when I was the curator at the Steel Plant Museum of Western New York, and we relocated to 100 Lee Street with Ed and the Western New York Railway Historical Society. So I'm very happy that you're here today. It's sort of like we're coming full circle.
Yeah, it is.
And with that, I'm going to turn this mic over to Ed. Okay. Welcome, Ed.
No. Okay. I'm going to be sitting for most of this presentation. I apologize in advance for that. I had 3 joint changes in the past 14 months. And I went to my doctor about it. And he says, I can tell you all about that. I said, what are you telling me? He says, you're getting old. So I'm live with it, you know. But anyway, what you're going to see tonight is a new program. That's one I hadn't thought about doing for a long time. And it's interesting because there's a lot of myths and mistruths and maybe plain lies, it depends on what you're looking at, on the Irish and their immigration patterns. What caused it, why did they do it, and how all this happened. So I thought, yeah, that's a good thing to put together. Why not? You're going to see some views of Buffalo you've probably never seen, some very, very rare. You get some of the oldest pictures I've ever seen of the First Ward, dating back to the 1860s. And we'll talk about, as we talk about the Irish experience, we'll also say a few things about the German community, which they were mostly in direct conflict because they were better educated and more money. And so it was a problem. And then later on, in the Canal District that the Crossroads book is about. I forget what they're called right now, but you know, the Central Warfare, something like that. Canal side. And back then it was called the Hooks. And that was by 1900, you'll see that it begins to change into an Italian community, and the Irish fled. So let's get into it. Gotta make sure those buttons on here. This is one of the stylized history maps that drives genealogical people crazy. It's kind of like a historical map of Buffalo, or of Buffalo, Ireland, and you'll see various figures from Irish history. Now, these are the county maps of Ireland, if you're ever gonna try to find out who your folks are, you gotta at least know the county. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but if you know the county, some very good researchers are in the room. One right there, my cousin, and they would really like to help you at the Buffalo Irish Genealogical Society, which that's 108th Street. It's a railroad museum, it's a steel plant museum, and of course, it's the Irish Genealogical Society. So what caused all the problem? This was the lumper potato. It was the cheapest, fastest growing thing that you could get, but it was very prolific. It was also the most prone to diseases. You would think that a potato famine would have happened earlier in Ireland, but it didn't, because it rains just about every day, even if it's just for a short time. But they're now regrowing it for historic purposes, and most people don't plant it anymore. But there are some traditionalists that still plant it on their farms because they can grow so much quantity in such a small place on terrible ground that they can feed their cattle and their horses. Yeah. All right. This is how they planted it. If you look at that rut that runs down through here, in the middle, that's a hand dug ditch, and they throw the dirt up on the side. They throw the potatoes in there, they throw a little dirt on top of it, and that's it. Now, they can leave and go over to England to work or some other places to work the farms, do what other jobs they had, because they needed more money. And what would happen is their wife and children would come along periodically, like you do when you grow potatoes now, throw a little more dirt on it, so they don't turn green. That's why they call them lazy beds. And of course, being on a hill, if it rained on top, it irrigated the rest of them. What really happened? Did everybody started at? There were 7 million people, plus 7.1, 7.2 million people in Ireland at the time of the famine. And they lost 1.5 million dead and 1.5 million left. It was more than likely half of them or more died because of this lice, body lice. That's what transmitted the diseases. Most of these people didn't just die of starvation, they were weakened by starvation. And then in a weakened state, they contracted just about anything, and the lice were their friends. So what were your options? Up until the point in time that the famine happened, and I better step back a minute and just tell you this. There, from the period of like 1300 up to 1900, there were 38 separate big famines. Now, every year in Ireland, if you lived on potatoes, there was a famine. You used up the potatoes except what you had to save for seed. And if you didn't save for seed, you had to somehow find the money to buy the seed. So, if you didn't have that, what would you do? Everybody raised a pig, and they had chickens. What was the pig for? The pig was for to pay the rent. None of these people owned land in Ireland by law. The British thought of that. You couldn't own a farm. You could rent a farm or lease a farm at the discretion of the landlord or his overseer. So you were at the mercy of whatever he decided you should do. Now, when you think about immigration and you think about a healthy population, and the Irish by the time of that famine were very healthy. That's why the population went from 3 million up to almost 7.2 million. They had 8 to 10 pounds of potatoes every day for every individual. How many people eat that many potatoes now? But with buttermilk from a cow, and possibly an egg from a chicken, you had all the basic amino acids which allowed you to survive and even thrive. Now, if you began to go back in history and you look at the families in 1300s, There was a horrible famine in 1340 on the West Coast. 600,000 people died. We don't talk about it. The Irish don't talk about it, but it was a horrible experience. Many of them turned to cannibalism to see if that would keep them alive. There were 3 times in the big famines that I've talked about where they had to turn to cannibalism because they didn't have any other choice. Now, you say, well, there's trees and forests and there with their deer and their rabbits. Yeah, you get caught touching a rabbit, you and your whole family would be deported to Tasmania or Australia. They didn't give you the short route to the United States and to Canada. You couldn't go anywhere else in the empire, the British Empire. That meant their whole family had to go. So if you have very large families, what happens when you want to rent land so you can start a family? It don't happen. So the first guy would get the farm. The second guy down would either be a religious, if you could get into a religious order. The third one joined the military, usually joined the British Army. And if there were any more than that after that, you were a slave. Now, we haven't talked about women, have I? You literally, if you didn't get married, you were a slave to your oldest brother. Farming is tough. And they need a lot of people to do these things. Right now, there was an article tonight on the news where they want to take the laws away for children that they can only work so many hours and stuff like that. They want to say they can work 12 hours and then go to school if it's open. They don't understand how farms work. And farming is a 24/7 occupation. And it's tough. That's why people had big families back then, even here. So if you had a healthy diet, and all of the other ones have left, the ones with that are older, they all left. The other ones literally become slaves. Their chance of ever owning anything is virtually nil. So, what were the other choices? If you lost your potato seed crop, or you lost the crop period, you couldn't plant oats and you couldn't plant wheat because of that belonged to the landlord. If you put it in the ground, he'd take it. All you had was potatoes, maybe a chicken. The pig, if you killed him, you had no rent, you would get evicted. Or you went into the workhouse. And this is a very large, this slide is not the best in the world, but it's one of those things where they would have the family go in as a family unit. First they'd separate the men and the women. Then they'd separate the children, the boys and the girls. In the workhouse, believe me, it was a nasty, vile place. You were almost guaranteed that half of them were going to die from fever when they get in there. They didn't know how to deal with those kinds of things. So if that was your choice, your whole family went in there. How did you get out of there? Die. Not many good choices, right? Now, up until that point in time, there were always people leaving Ireland for the reasons we just talked about. And there were only several big ports that they really came from. Dublin, obviously, Belfast, obviously, and in Cork. Now, Cork has a sister city right next to it called Cove. If you look for it on the map, it's C-O-B-H. The Gaelic alphabet is kind of screwed up. They only have 16 letters versus 26. But so they would have to make their way down to Cove, get on a ship there, and then sail across the Atlantic. Many of them didn't go directly though, because the ships were gone or they were subscribed to the people who were traveling there. So what did they do? They got on small boats and they went to England, particularly to Liverpool. Let me go back to this. And they'd take a small sailing ship over to Liverpool, and there were plenty of ships coming out of England. Now, when you get to the point where you have 1.5 million people leaving the country, businessmen will start to look at opportunities to make some money. So what did they do? Now, I know you may have heard the term coffin ships. They literally were coffins. They went into the backwaters of the Thames River, and where these old sailing ships were sunk, they pumped them out, patched them up what they could, put used sails and used ropes on them, hired some guy that probably didn't know what the heck he was doing to be the captain, and a crew. And if they couldn't get crew, they got some prisoners out of prison and they put them on there, and they loaded it up with, poor Irishmen. How many have made it across the Atlantic? If 1 out of 10 made it across the Atlantic, it would have been a lot. But they had the money up front, the people who owned it. And if you were trying to get on a United States ship, they were highly regulated. You couldn't do that. If you were trying to get on a British ship per se, it had to be insured by Lloyd's of London. And most of them didn't have any insurance at all. Just get on the ship and go. So you can understand how many people died that had no control over how they died. What was left? This is a place called Skibbereen. It's in West Cork. And we had gone there to negotiate with the various governmental bodies we had to create a Irish famine monument in Buffalo. And we did. And we traveled around with the folks there, got to be good friends with them, and over the course of the next 2 years, we raised enough money to buy a special stone from Carroll Road in County Galway. That's the Irish-speaking area. And also raised enough money from people who subscribed to that, so they could commemorate their families. And if you were to go down now on the Buffalo waterfront, there's a beautiful monument there. Some of it's written in the Irish language, and then some of it's written in English. But that is typical of the standing stones that you would have seen in Ireland. So this is Skibbereen, and this green lawn that you see here, I don't know why this thing isn't bright enough. Okay. Well, it doesn't matter. This green area here is a mass grave. It's a mass grave that was put there by the British soldiers who had the unenviable task to go to Skibbereen because of the reports of men who had traveled through there that the entire town was dead. And it was so terrible that the foxes and dogs were eating the cadavers. And the stench was horrible. But they did. They dragged them to this spot just outside the village. And that is a burial for about 700 people. This is the monument that they put up to the Irish famine. You know, it's really curious when you study Irish history and you go there. If you look at the older textbooks, they never mention the famines. They don't talk about it. They didn't talk about it. Even people that knew their grandmothers and great-grandmothers, they never talked about it. It was so horrible. So anyway, they finally decided to put this commemoration thing there, and it's a cute little monument. I just want to point out to one of my friends, the fellow there is deceased now. It's Dr. Charles Trainer. When we started this, we had 26 Irish organizations in Western New York. And they didn't always see eye to eye, all those 26 organizations. If you were going after money, they were too. So most of the time, the same sources. This guy pulled them all together. Now, if you're a mathematician, you know this guy because he has 2 international spaceship stuff. How navigators work in space, because you have no compass. He did the Trainer equations. Look them up sometime. I have a laugh. That math is over my head. I was a historian. You know, I could do math, but not that math. Anyway, I wanted to show him because he was leading our delegation, and this is the rest of the graveyard in Skibbereen. It still isn't a very big village. It's still small. Now, what was Ireland like during the famine? Just like that. Green as can be. You ever hear the song 20 Shades of Green? 40 Shades of Green? Yeah. I can't recognize 40, but there's 20, at least. This is what Ireland looks like all the time. It's that green. Because it missed every single day, just about. You imagine leaving this and then going on a ship across the ocean that might not make it, and then landing in New York City where you got hundreds of people who are trying to take whatever you have left or take advantage of you. And then somehow making it out of there and making your way out of Erie Canal or later on trains to Buffalo. Wow, that's a journey. That's the Bandon River in West Cork. This is the Cove Harbor, and you can go there today. They have a museum. It's a former railroad station, you know, and it's wonderful. They do a pretty good job, but the myth over there was that when your folks get on the hill around on the ship, there's a big hill outside of Cove, and they would run up to the top. I can tell you it's a good 10-minute drive in a car, and it's pretty hilly, and they were weak, and there's no way in hell that they went up that hill to wave goodbye to the ship leaving the harbor. Now, this is Penrose Quay. They call it a key. And if you want to see Penrose Quay today, if you go down to see the Famine Monument, you'll be looking at Penrose Quay, Penrose Quay. That is made out of the limestone blocks that pier was made of. Now, this is where hyperbole takes over. You look at these folks, well, they don't look too bad off. Good pants and shirt and a jacket, and mom's got shawls and a kerchief and all that. Very few people had that type of clothing. Most of them that was falling off their backs. There were groups down there trying to put clothing on them, like the Quakers and some others, that would purchase old clothing or get it donated, and they would put them on saying, you can't go to America like that. Did all of them get it? No. So that is this is what they used to commemorate the famine a number of years ago. They used this image. We talked about the small boat sailing to England, and that in itself was an experience. Most of these people had never been on a boat. You know, the guys that lived on the boat were mostly on the western side of Ireland. They were fishermen, so they knew about small boats. But an average person off a farm somewhere, get on a boat, he must have been scared. This is a coffin ship, what they looked like. And of course, they did open cooking on the decks. They put a few bricks from the hole up on the deck, and they'd start a fire in those bricks. And of course, it was a windy day. Who knows what had happened? If they had a fire on board, everybody died. So, was there other food in Ireland at the time? Now, here it talks about an Indian corn in Cork. They called our type of corn Indian corn. They also called wheat and oats corn. The crop from them was always called corn. So the idea was that they sent ships over from England when they could, loaded with Indian corn, and they'd get them into ports and then put them in a locked house, a warehouse. You could get that corn if you had money. If you didn't have any money, you didn't get any corn. Now, if you go back to the time, this was when they began doing the evictions. Once you ran out of money, you were done. They threw you out. And why did they do that? Well, the infinite wisdom of the British at the time, with people that were just like them, was that you could not get anything for free. If you were starving and you had no job, you had to find some way to get money. Now, there were some work projects that they put together. Some of the better landlords, they built roads to nowhere. They're still there. When you go around through Ireland, you can see these things. They don't go anywhere. It was making them work a full day, which was usually 12 hours, breaking rocks into pebbles to make a road. Now, if you're weakened from hunger, how much do you think you'd last with something like that? Not very often. So when they evicted it, people say, well, why didn't they resist? You come in there with an army unit and police. And you're talking about people that have been starving for a month or two. And you say, why didn't they resist? How could they? They couldn't. Did every landlord do that? No, some of them did. Some of them started little soup kitchens and things like that. But what happened was this. The landlords had to pay for the poor relief. So if you wanted to give people access to food, you had to pay a tax. And that's what the landlords were saddled with, the poor tax. How did they do it? Either through the workhouse system, or they would have a soup kitchen in a town. A lot of people didn't live in towns. You would have to walk for miles. There's a trail up in County Donegal that goes from the west coast in almost 75 miles to the nearest village. When you go on that road today, you still don't see any cars. It's still 75 miles, and there's not a building in sight. When you get to the town at the end of that, just before you get to the town, there's a plaque mounted on a mountain wall that says 100 people started the trek to make it to this town because they were going to give some food away. The 100 people died on the trek by themselves. There's a commemoration of plaque on the side of the wall. So they weren't given too many options, let's put it that way. But what else did they do? And this is one of the things that you see even today when they commemorate the famine immigrants or immigrants for them. That tree is called a prayer tree, and that pile of stones is a holy well. And there are holy wells all around Ireland. You can go and see them. They still have them. People still believe in the powers of the holy well. They still use them. It's an honest, heartfelt feeling that they have towards that. If you notice on the branches, though, on the left there, you'll see little scraps of cloth, not paper because they didn't have it. Little scraps of cloth, and on that, if they could find somebody that could write the name of their immigrant, like an amanuensis, that's somebody that writes a letter for somebody else, that's what you would find. And you can still go there today and people will still commemorate people that left 150 years ago. They never came back. And they never had any, let's say, that they never had any communications. You couldn't write, you couldn't read because you couldn't write and read by law. You weren't allowed to go to school if you were a Catholic. They passed the penal laws. And those penal laws in the early 1800s, when they put them in there, you couldn't own a farm if you were a Catholic. You couldn't own a horse worth 100 pounds if you were a Catholic. And you couldn't run a farm if it wasn't there. So this is how they do commemorate today. But the second day after they had ousted, what happened to them? If you look here, you can see a makeshift little hut that the guy somehow put up. He still didn't have any food. And those little places were found on all the highways leading up to the principal town, usually with dead people. So what happened when they got there? How many of you ever seen that Nina, no Irish Nina pie, knew about it? Well, the analogy is this. You got 1.5 million people coming to America. First place they're going to hit are these seacoast towns like Boston or New York. Okay? Every one of those people are going to be competing for a job, any kind of job. They'll take anything. It got to the point where the people there said, I need to hire maids or servants or whatever, housekeepers, but no Irish need apply. This is a medal sign. They were really serious about it. Most of them were just hand painted on a board. N-I-N-A. As soon as they saw that, if they could read, they'd try knocking on the door, they'd be beaten away by the servants. Because there were so many of them. Now, if you go in any of the old newspapers of the period, in Britain, even in Ireland, even in the United States, this is the caricature that you would have seen. about how the people felt about the Irish. This is what they all thought they all were. Wearing clothes from the late 1700s. With a, I would say, a grotesque face, short in stature. And this is what the newspapers were like. So every time that they ran an article about the mobs of immigrants arriving daily, if it was in New York, it would be South Street Seaport, because they didn't have an Ellis Island then. This is what they said you're gonna run into. You're gonna hire that guy? Probably not. Now, were there any real resistance? Yes. There were several instances where mobs of people tried to storm the buildings that were holding the grain. And it wasn't very successful. They took an awful beating. Those people were deported, them and their whole families. This is what South Street Seaport looked back in the day. You can go down there today. A lot of people don't go there. And it's a shame, because they go to Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty and things like that. That's wonderful. But Ellis Island was built in 1892. Before that, in 1847, there was no Ellis Island. Now, up until about 1870, mid-1850s, Castle Garden, which is still existing, that was the immigrant station that people came to. That was an old entertainment building. First of all, it was built by the military in 1811, and it was used for military purposes. And then, obviously, warfare outgrew the need to have something like that. And so they sold it to the city of New York. It became an entertainment hall. 3 times the size of coin hands, you know, if you've been there. And it was just a big entertainment hall that everybody came to. Then it became this immigration center. And it was there until 1892. And of course, Ellis Island, as we know, burned down in 1892 after it was built. So they had to go back there for another 2 years. And in 1894, Ellis Island was the principal place where immigrants came into. Now, I say that because sitting in this thing is probably one person in this room that says, I got news for you. My people didn't come like this, they came through Canada. Yeah, they did. They would come to Gros Isle up in Quebec. You want to ever see a horror house? Gros Isle was a horror house. It was an island in the middle of the St. Lawrence River. And when you're looking at the crowds of people that came in there, they literally had no room. They built barracks and they did everything they could to house them, but they couldn't process them fast enough. What happens when you get people that live the way they live and you get them in a crowded room? How many are going to die of disease? What's most impressive, in a way, about that Gros Isle is the cemeteries. They're huge. No markers, just sunken ground. And of course, they buried many bodies right in the same hole. But if your folks were lucky enough to get through Gros Isle and make their way down to York, which Toronto used to be called, you had a chance at freedom and getting either staying in Canada or coming across the ferry boat into Buffalo, because they did not have any peace bridges. They had a ferry boat. Now, this is what it kind of looked like in the 1890s, and those buildings still exist. So what was left at home? You look at these and you say, how did people live there? No window, no door. Why do you think that happened? Because the landlord would get taxed if you put a window in, and you would get taxed extra if you put a door in. If you hang a blanket or some piece of something there wouldn't be taxed on that. Who does the tax get passed on to? The tenants. So, this is what they mostly look like. This, of course, was a tumble down thing. The first thing they would do is when they evicted the people, if they were going to get rid of the permanent residents, and they didn't want them anymore. Because what was happening is they found out it was safer and easier and cheaper to run cattle and horses on your estate than it was to have people on there. So the first thing you did was rip all the roofing off and then burn the roofing up. So nobody could live in that anyway. People that got evicted from another place couldn't sneak in at night and have a dry place to be. So what did they go to? Anybody have an idea what this is? First ward. This is what the housing down there looked like in the first ward in 1850. So why is that important? Well, between 1850 and 1855, Buffalo literally became a German city. There were 10,000 Irishmen that had come into Buffalo in the 1850s. 10,000. But there were 3 times that amount in Germans. And eventually they had many German mayors. And of course they had many German newspapers in German, and that's the way life was. So this was by far way better than anything they ever had in Ireland. The difference here was they had jobs and they could get jobs. And nobody cared what you were as long as you had a strong back and were willing to work. Now, people always talk about the first ward being a big Irish settlement. It wasn't. So 1870s and 80s, it was just single family houses. In many cases, there were no streets, just principal thoroughfares running down through there. This one I want to point out to you is it's called a peninsula down now, but it's down at the foot of Hamburg Street. And you can see this big loop in the river. See that thing says Wheelbarrow Point? Yeah. What do you think that was? They built a big steel mill, iron mill. And you know, when they pour off iron, they get a lot of slag. And the slag is useless. You can't do anything with it other than crush it up. Now sometimes they use it for road building. But there was a steady stream of men with wheelbarrows wheeling the slag down across the Buffalo River. Oh yeah, how'd they get across the Buffalo River? It was ankle deep at this point. You can walk across the Buffalo River and never get your knees wet. Yeah. It wasn't until much later when they built big steel plants and they had to get big boats up there that the Buffalo River was deepened. So you see Farmers Point down there at the bottom of the pink area? Yeah. That was really Farmers Brothers Point. Okay, who's Farmer's brother? How many of you ever heard of the name Corn Planter? Huh? Okay, he was a principal Seneca chief, and this was Farmer's brother was his brother, and he was the chief of this Indian village at the lower point there. In this area, George and Dewey and N.W. Dean, they owned the land. They said they did anyway, even though it was Indian reservation. They owned it. They bought it from somebody. Well, Farmers Brothers Point, was an Indian village for quite a long time. And they didn't like it because they didn't like the Native Americans coming up into the city of Buffalo because it was illegal to sell them liquor. Now, how many people do you know that would do that without getting permission? It didn't happen. But eventually they were squeezed out, okay? Now, this big rolling mill that you see here in green, I don't know why this pointer isn't working, I know I got it on. Anyway, that area in green is called the Union Ironworks. And it was a mostly Eastern Pennsylvania group of investors that decided in 1860 they were going to build a big iron making mill in Buffalo because they saw that there were a lot of small industries that were building off of the George Tifton Sons, their ironworks down at the foot of Main Street. And of course, George Tifton Sons quickly realized that they were running out of room to have a steel mill at the foot of Main Street. So what happened was these guys took advantage of that, and they built this steel furnaces, iron furnaces, one to start with, and then of course, a rolling mill on top of that. And then they walled a big wall all around the whole plant. The whole thing had a wall around it. The only place in New York I've ever found a walled-in company town. Now I have to come up here and point out to this pink square up here. See those little black dots? Every one of those is a house. A small house, to be sure, but they were inside the plant. They did not want outsiders coming inside the plant. So you had to go through the gate in order to get in and out of there. All of those people, the men were employed in the rolling mills and in the steel mill. On the docks where they unloaded the iron ore and the coal at that time. And amazingly enough, even with later on, and we'll talk about them in a little bit, but even with the other mills coming on, you would think that they would have gone under. But they didn't. They went all the way through World War II. And it wasn't until World War II, at the end of it, when the other steel plants got a big influx of federal money, because they saw the Korean War coming on, this mill finally closed. Now, in the 60s, you could drive down there. I used to go down there as a pilgrimage to see where my great-great-grandparents lived. That was where they lived, inside the plant. And there was an article in an old Buffalo paper about the first settler in there was William Patton. He had come from Boston. And I tell you, I looked for years to find out why in God's name would a guy from Donegal, out in the country, where it was very mountainous, why would he come to Buffalo when he was working up in Boston there as a carpenter, working on ships, mostly canal boats and stuff like that. I puzzled for a long time until I went over to Ireland. And somebody says, the old mill is right over there, over in Kiltyvogue. Kiltyvogue is a crossroads. There's a church there. There's nothing else, just a church. But there are cemeteries, big cemeteries there. And if you go in there, there's a whole lot of Pattons buried in there. What I learned was there was a small iron foundry just over what they call a river. We call them creeks. They're so small. And in that, they made iron by hand. And they would lever it up to pour it out into some molds. And when they wanted to do that, they had to get all the air out of that metal. And they had a process called puddling. That's what they used here at this plant. They didn't have machinery to do it. This was old fashioned. Everybody has to do a hand job on that to make it work. Well, what I learned was it was about a quarter of a mile from my great-great-grandfather's house. That's where they worked. Any farming they did was in addition to the raised the potatoes and a cow or two or a pig or whatever. This is what they did. They puddled iron. They got the air bubbles out and then they poured it. So when my great-great-grandfather, living in North Boston, was working there in the shipyards, and the shipyards were starting to slow down. He was married to a lady named Mary Burns, and Mary Burns had a cousin that worked for the Union Bridge and Iron Works. And she said, we're going up to Buffalo. And she was down in, I think, somewhere in the eastern part. I don't remember exactly where it was coming. But the point of it is, they decided to come to Buffalo. And he said, puddling? I know how to do puddling. I've done it. So they hired him. He was one of the first people hired there. But they said, by the way, we get company housing. It's right there. See that pile of lumber? If you build that house, you can live in that house. And that's what he did. So this became a very important community. Now, looking at the first ward, if you look at the first ward up in the top corner, those pink lands and yellow ones, you see Sandusky Street. Sandusky Street was the original name and it was changed to O'Connell Avenue. And that's where it is today. But you see all that open land up there. There's no buildings. That's the way the whole first ward was in or 1861, when they opened this plant. Now, this is the kind of living that they had. There's number 15 Excelsior Street. It was 12 by 17. They had 9 people living in that 12 by 7 house. So they weren't living high off the hog, you know. It was tough. But in the wintertime you froze, and in the summertime you overheated. When they built those houses, this was the floodplain for the Buffalo River.
Oh.
So every year the water would flood for a short period of time and then go down, and then you walk through muck forever until it dried out. Well, how did these people get in and out to go to work, go to school? They built aerial walkways on stilts. And they built them from the last house to the first house to the main street, which would run into Hamburg Street today. And so that's how they got out there. Now, that lasted for quite a long time until they got enough slaves from the furnace to fill in underneath the houses. And if you go down there today, there's a tractor trailer training school. But if you tried to drill right there, you'd run into all kinds of slag, because that's what it is. Now it's covered with blacktop. So that lasted until about 1870, and they closed. And then they reopened under new ownership as Union Bridge and Iron Works. And then it kind of closed up again. And then it was closed for quite a while. Then the Cameron Baird family, and some of you may know that they have a Cameron Baird Foundation still today. That's what came out of all this. Now, there's one of the houses. This would have been addition on this end. The little one was the one you had. There was a court case in Buffalo when they decided to evict everybody because they needed more land for the plant. And this is the same story for many, many places. You know, if somebody comes in and wants that, you have a house, it doesn't matter how long you've been there, how much you paid for it, eminent domain, they take it away and they build what they want to build. So they told my great-great-grandfather that, get out. He says, what about my house? I built it with my own hands. So evidently he found the right judge. And the judge ruled that he could have the house, but he had to get it out of there. So he got a bunch of Irish friends, and they got some round logs and placed it under that house, and they moved it over to Sandusky Street. And it's still there today.
What number?
Now,
Yeah.
What number of town?
I don't know. All I know is we called it the 15 house because it was 15 Excelsior. And that's one of those things I should know, but I don't. Down in the pit with the Buffalo miners, you can see the kind of handwork that they were doing. It was really rough. The next picture is going to show you more of that. And this is the reason that they failed later on. See that big heavy bucket? They're pulling it by hand. And they pulled it for 12 hours a day. You know what the work week was like back then? You work 6 days a week, you work 12 hours a day normally, and on Saturday, you got half a day off. Yeah, and that was your recreational time because on Sunday, you had to go to church. There was no working on Sunday. But they had a skeleton crew inside the blast furnace, still working. Now, I don't know how they got away with that, but maybe they only worked for so long and then they caught a church service later on, but this is what they worked like. And they were still working like this in 1890 when the other steel plants were built and they were using all power. The American Civil War, the 1870s and 80s, the rest of the story. This is the earliest photo that I have been able to find down in the First Ward. It is 1860. And what you see on the left is the Riter, R-I-T-E-R, boiler shop. And you see the workforce there. And I want you to notice the building immediately to the right. You see it's a frame, 2-story. A year later, it's gone. And there's a multi-story there, and this was where some of the guys lived when they worked in the Riker Boiler Center. A year later, they had made so much money that they called it the Eagle Boiler Works. And if you're an architectural fan, anytime you hear somebody mention Eagle Iron Works around Buffalo, you see these cast iron trim around a window on a brick building, it's probably from the Eagle Iron Works. They ship stuff all over the country and even out of the country. And it was very ornate, it was very well done. That happened right here on Illinois Street. If you go to Illinois Street now, it's a parking lot for the ice cream. But look at that, in 1 year's time, they went from that to that. Tear it down, build a new one. That's what they did. Now, Civil War, during the Civil War, you had approximately 150,000 people from New York State that fought in the Irish Brigade. 2 regiments which came from Buffalo, the 155th and the 164th. Both of them were made up entirely of Irishmen. Is there another one that moved in there? Maybe your grandfather was German and he got into it. I'm not going to argue with you. It's commemorated now because both of those units have reenactment units that are very authentic. How do I know? I was part of it for a while. When you see the film Gettysburg, when that happened, the commemoration of the Gettysburg battle, we were living in shelter house. We had real salt pork and hardtack, and that's what we ate. That's what we fought with, and that's what we puked with. Just so you know. If you ever get a chance to see them, you'll see that they're very, very authentic. But those units, 155th and 164th, were in every major conflict during the Civil War. You want to name the ones where a lot of people got lost? Out of 1,100 men they started with, there was only about 30 that lived through the war. It was brutal, absolutely brutal. So what did that do for them? You come back from the war, you're still an Irishman. No Irish need apply. What's this? Mass meeting of Fenians. Irishmen and all friends of Liberty St. James Hall. Some starry-eyed Irishmen decided, because that they have military training now, they wanted to raise a movement in Buffalo and other places like Detroit and up along the St. Lawrence River, and they were going to start training in the streets to bring up excitement and get people to maybe even join up. And they were going to invade Canada. And they were going to take over a portion of Canada and hold it until the Britain's folks got out of Ireland. Well, they got across the river on canal boats towed by tugs. And they did get in the streets of Ridgeway, and then they met, unfortunately for that poor militia outfit, because the Canadians couldn't control anything because they were not a full member of the British community. They realized that all they had were militia people. Now, these guys hadn't fought a war, they just marched. And they looked great. Boy, they had nice coats, sparkling brass and everything. But they were coming up against hardened veterans. They broke and ran. A lot of them died. Didn't mean any Indians didn't die. There was some that did die too. Now, they thought that all of those people on the other side of the border, as soon as they got in there, many of them were probably of Irish extraction, and they were going to rise up with them, and they were going to feed them and take care of them. And that wasn't the case. So they decided that discretion is the better part of valor. They started to retreat. And of course, when they got where the Peace Bridge is today, what happened is the President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, said, take them in custody and put them in ships and leave them there until I can decide what we're going to do with them. That's what happened. They languished for about a year. Of course, they had to feed them, and they did. But when the Fuhrer died down And the Fenian movement died down because they had a minor raid up off across the St. Lawrence that didn't go anywhere. And they had one off from Detroit going across, and that didn't go anywhere. Were there a few zealots that still hung on? Yeah, for another 5 years, and then it just kind of faded away. So they let them out. They let them out of the boats, and they said, "Go back to work and don't be stupid." Well, we almost got it, right? We won one battle. Now, we talked about Uniontown. We talked about something about the Eighth Ward. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But there was another Irish community down here. Anybody know where this is? Okay, this is the beach community. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of people. Every time I run into somebody, they say, "Oh, my folks were beachers." Well, they could have been. What was the name? I knew a lot of the names down there, because part of our book was written about that. And here you see railroad tracks running in front of these. These were built on the breakwall out on the road that leads to the lighthouse. So it was free land. And the lake being what it was, and shipping being what it was, there were hundreds of schooners, old-fashioned sailing boats, even in an age of steam. What did they haul? Lumber. From upper Michigan and all of these places, they were bringing fresh lumber into Buffalo, which later was transported up to Tonawanda. That's became lumber capital of Western New York. And of course, they had to go through storms on Lake Erie. Now, if you're a captain on the lakes and your hold is full of lumber, what do? You stack it up on deck as high as you can stack it and still sail the ship, and it doesn't turn over. And they sailed down the lake, and if the lake got rough, first thing that went was the lumber. All those houses, as far as you can see, was built with that lumber. They were opportunists. I mean, a 2x6 go down to the beach. Now, this was mostly Irishmen. Before anybody says I'm Portuguese, I'm going to say that they weren't all Irishmen. There was a large, significant Portuguese community. And they did the same things that the Irishmen did. They fished. Now, there's more stories about that, and we'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. But for the most part, that's what they did. In the summertime in boats, they could be out in Lake Erie, and they'd catch a lot of fish, and they'd salt it down. Whatever didn't get consumed locally would be shipped by the Erie Canal. In 3 days, 4 days, it would be down in New York City, ready to go. So what did they do in the winter? They fished the ice. They had dog sleds. They would go out on the lake. And they had their own areas that they had marked with a flagpole, a little sapling with a strip of cloth on it, and they would fish through the ice. There are many, many, many stories. If you ever get a chance to start going through some of the old newspapers, you'll see all kinds of stories. 100 men stranded on the ice. They didn't have helicopters or anything to go get them then. They had to do it the same way, dog sleds, or just gangs of people with ropes and try to pull them across the opening. It was a rough, tough life. Now, were all of the people that grew up on the beach, and this is where I get even with these people who say they were beachers, were they all upstanding people? No. They were pirates, some of them. Now, not all. They stole a lake freighter, a big one. And they painted it during the night, they painted a different name on it, and they sailed it all the way up to Lake Michigan. And then it disappeared. It was probably sold off and repainted, and then it became another ship. It happened down there. The other thing is that some of you may remember, and it's only the older people in the crowd, and I think I'm the only one old enough to remember. In the wintertime, there would be dozens of lake freighters tied up to the outer breakwall. And as they needed them, the tugboats would go out, and they'd hook on those boats and bring them into the grain mills, and they'd empty out the hold. Then they'd take them back out, tie them up to the breakwall. And in the springtime, when season opened, the little ferry boats would pick up the crew and take them out there. They'd get it going, and up the lake they went. So they did that. However, there were a lot of cargo ships bringing very valuable items into Buffalo. And of course, the crew had been on the lakes for a number of days, stopping at different ports, picking up this stuff. And some of the fellas down there, and I don't know if you're gonna believe this or not, but they were known to make poachine. Does anybody know what poachine is? Hooch, moonshine. It's the Irish word for poachine. Of course, the Irish word for whiskey is whiskabata. That's the water of life. So, it's a Gaelic lesson, you can take that one home. Maybe you win a bet in the bar with it, but they would say to the fellas there on the boat, "Captain letting you off tonight?" "No." "They got the other guys going. We don't get off until next stop. Have some whiskey. And have some more." And of course, what would happen then, he was the watchman, he was waylaid, drunk as a skunk, and they clean out whatever cargo they could find, and anything else that wasn't nailed down. And the next day it would appear on the streets of Buffalo where you could buy that stuff. Does that sound familiar? People do that today? I don't know. So when you see something on the beach, just say, "Well, what is that?" That'll get their attention. So, anyway, this lasted until 1917. This is a community as it was in 1917. What happened was that because it was free land and it didn't belong to the city of Buffalo, at least at that point, they decided that the railroads were intruding on the folks that were there, and they weren't paying any money, and the railroads had a lot of money in 1917. So they wanted more of that money. And of course, the people there, they took unkindly to the people bringing those railroad cars in there. The men didn't do it because they'd go in prison, but the women did. They pelted them with stones. And then when they got done with the stones and they couldn't find any close at hand, they would use Irish grenades. You know what an Irish grenade is? A potato. When I read those stories in the news, I fell off my chair and laughed. They didn't have any stones, they threw potatoes. But in 1917, it got really bad. The city said, "You're all going." Well, people said, "I built this house, I want this house." You know, why? I want it. Get it out of here. So some enterprising people, they rented a scow. They put 2 houses on the scow, that's how small they were. Put 2 houses on the scow and they pole it across the Buffalo River and unload it on the other side, roll it up into the first ward. I think most of those houses that survived were on Kentucky and Kentucky Street. I don't remember if there was any other ones. And the rest of them were just toned. So what happened? Well, the city leveled everything off nice and even, and they invited the railroads to come in there. But they had to pay rent. So that was the end of the beach community. Now, somebody's gonna think in their mind, well, where did the Portuguese go? In the 4th ward, which is up near where the library downtown today, there was a large family of folks there from different countries. And the early Latins, Hispanics who came in there, they had settled in that area. First of all, because the people who were living there, the Germans didn't care, you know, they weren't worried about them. And secondly, here you had these Portuguese that spoke a language similar to Spanish, but not really. The endings are all different. But they settled in there, and then eventually they began to mix those families together. There's a cute girl, I don't care what she is. She can be anything you want, but I'm going to go after her. Well, you got, she's Portuguese. Who cares? So they settled in the lower 4th ward, which would be down towards Seneca Street. And those little streets that used to be in there were taken away by what I call not urban renewal, but urban destruction. So what else was happening down there that was still going to create jobs? I think we're going to sit down. That's the longest I stood in quite a while. Okay. So there needed to be more jobs created for these types of folks. that can work at labor. And somebody said, well, you're kind of not talking about immigration. Well, there wasn't a whole lot of immigration going on from Ireland. It was up until the 1870s, it was caused by either warfare and or starvation and inheritance and all those other things that were still taking place. There were people like Daniel O'Connell and Michael McDavitt in Ireland who had these monster meetings on the hilltops in Ireland, and people would come from miles around. And there are estimates that there might have been 500,000 people or more, which would be a significant amount of the population of Ireland that attended these things. And they pushed the British government, said, yeah, the longer you let this go, the worse it's going to be. It's going to foment rebellion, and it's going to be killing, and the principles are going to be attacked. And some of them were. So it was a case where the British Parliament decided that, well, maybe we ought to talk about something like home rule, because that's what O'Connell and McDavitt were talking about. Home rule, we'll have our own parliament, we'll have our own laws, and the first thing we're going to go after is the land. You can keep a whole lot of land, but we want a land for each, some land for each family. An acre, half an acre, a couple acres, at the most, where they can plant potatoes, because they were still planting them, a little bit of corn, a little bit of oats, and have room for a cow to run. Why was that important? Well, you'd have to go back in history, because the Irish used during the Gaelic period, when you were back in the 1200s, when the Norse had come down, people gathered together for protection against, the Vikings. What they used was a rundale system, R-U-N-D-A-L-E. Everybody had a cow or two, most of one. One guy would have a bull and he would make the most money because he'd keep the cows in milk. So they'd all put their cows into this herd, and this herd would go out into the areas outside that weren't being used for, let's say, for planting. But there's a whole lot of Ireland that not really accessible for planting. It's either rocky or straight up and down, or it's disconnected by streams, so you had to ford the stream in order to do that. And so, using the rundale system, that meant that they could do other labor. They wouldn't have to worry about that. A couple of lads from the village, that's how they earned their keep. They would take care of the cows. You had a dog or two, that would finish the job. So what had happened is they do that. Now, that was good up until about 1500, and that's when the British took over. And in 1500, that's when they really started clamping down on the Irish. Up until that time, you had Gaelic chieftains that ran their clans. Now, somebody said you were the O'Neill clan, or you were one of these other clans. You would be under the protection of them. Were you related by blood? Maybe, maybe not. But you would have to keep a pike, which was a weapon of the time, a lance with a sharp end on it, or some other weapon, as having a sword was virtually impossible. They were too expensive. So you had to march once a year with the Lord's troops over there, just to show that if he had problems, that you would support him. All right, so that went on for all of these years, and of course, many of the wars chewed up a lot of people. And we'll find out that when you look at the changes in the 1870s, in let's say in Europe, that were taking place, the German mothers were really angry at the barons that owned all the land in Germany. Because every year there was a war against this baron, said something nasty to that baron, and they were going to go to war. And what did they do? They chewed up whole villages of young men just to satisfy this baron who could give life. He could care less. He was over in Versailles, talking to the French king or something. And the same thing happened in Italy. And you had guys like Garibaldi, and of course in Germany, Bismarck and the rest of them, that they were always going to war. They said, we've got to stop this some way. A lot of people voted with their feet. I'm getting out of town. I'm not doing this anymore. Well, 1870, we saw a push to get land reform, and they started the process. How long did it take? 50 years, 52 years, to be almost exact. It took a war of rebellion to force the England. And when did it happen? It happened during the First World War, when all the British troops were over in Europe. They said, now's the time to strike. So they did. Now, there wasn't as much immigration into the US from Ireland in the period. There was hope that this land reform was going to be a quick thing, and they were going to be able to get a farm, and they were going to be able to get a wife and start a family. But it took that long. It took the Irish War of Rebellion in 1920. And then in 1922, there was an Irish Civil War. Half of Ireland didn't want to accept the treaty that had been negotiated by the leader, David de Valera. And half of them, under Michael Collins, decided that the treaty was wrong, that we shouldn't have given them anything. We should have just taken our land back. That they were powerless to come and get us. So what happened? Brother against brother, father against father. A lot of people died. Were there atrocities committed? Wow, you can't imagine. Whole villages, and many of them might be related to you, but because they had signed up with the treaty guys, they lined you against the wall and killed you. It was brutal, vicious. So once that was settled, by that time, the Irish government realized they had a problem. And the remaining landlords were forced into selling off frontage on roads where people could get their produce grown in the market, or just get back and forth for a job once they planted their crops. That was when the real reform happened. Not until. It took a lot of bloodshed to make it happen. So what we see here is a coal dock in the background. And as the sailing vessels began to lose out to steam, they needed a place to bring a lot of coal. And of course, we did have, in this period, we did have natural gas, but they didn't use it for a fuel, they used it for lighting. And in areas where it was impossible at the time to start stringing wires, they could get the gas into the homes. And so a lot of people used illumination gas. In some cases, only one that they would have maybe in the main room or in the kitchen, a little jet coming out of there. And some of us remember they had a little cloth bag that would go over that jet. Yeah. And you'd light it up and let it burn for a minute until it went out. Then you turn the gas valve on and lit it. Scary, huh? Why? Gas. What are you doing with your gas on? No, gas stove all the time. You do that. But they needed a lot of coal. And this is what they built. Lots of jobs, hundreds of men working there. Still men working on the older boats, and we can see the remnants of a tug. Others ran a bumboat. This is called a bumboat. They would, you could call them a ferry if you want. You can see canal boats in the background. That's what a real canal boat looked like. And these crew would have to go and either get supplies and bring them in these bumboats, or if they had no passengers, they literally would load up the boat and go from ship to ship saying, you want to buy some tomatoes or potatoes or whatever. Or if the captain wasn't looking, here's a six-pack, you know. Of course, they kept that hidden. Migration. Wasn't that what we were talking about? No. What we talked about was immigration into Buffalo. Now, so far, all of this in Buffalo went on in an area from Smith Street down to Main Street and up to Exchange Street. That area, that's where all the Irish were living. That's where all of them were dying, that's where they were working, that's where they went to school, that's where they went to church. So now, industrial growth, they're out of land too, so they began moving outside the railroad loop. And they said, well, there's opportunity because there's a lot of land in South Buffalo. This one here is the Buffalo Creek Original Yard Office, and it's next to the Ohio Street Bridge in 1935. It was built much earlier. My grandfather worked in that building. He worked as yard master, telling people where to go. Before that, he had been an operator or an engineer operator. Now, as the industrial plants began to modernize, they moved large quantities of things instead of with mules, horses, and the guys hauling the buckets. They began using it with using mechanized things like these little steam engines. And here's a switcher engine moving things around in there. Now, nobody alive today will probably recognize this unless when a little kid you went to the Army Navy stores down on Seneca Street. This is what the growth, the business growth was like down there. In this picture, it was called Elk Street. Now it's called South Park. They changed it later on. That was Elk Street. And you can see all of the bigger buildings, a church, and you're gonna see other things being built there. The Elk Street Market. Some of those buildings still exist today. Carl Pellegrino bought most of them. And a lot of them were torn down. This is where you went every day to get the food you needed, or every second day or third day, if you had the money. Now, these are very rare pictures. Yeah, they haven't been shown in any other venue, so you got a first here. And what you're looking at is Louisiana Street. And you see the railroad tracks in the middle, those are trolley tracks. Now, you're gonna look closely at that picture, and this is what I call the picture within the picture. Look at the sidewalk over here, what's that? Railroad track. Yeah, why is it there? It doesn't go anywhere. Stops at the bridge. The Lackawanna Railroad's running over the top. This track was owned by the Erie Railroad. And the Erie Railroad had a wider gauge, so nobody could run on their tracks. And so they built the track up to the bridge. In case they ever found opportunity to go on the other side, they would force the Lackawanna to put a pier in farther so they could get trains through there. Because you remember, railroads were down there. Now, this is Elk Street in Moore. And this building on the left was the New York Central building. It's still there. It's still buried in the foundations of the bridge foundation that you see there. This is a cobblestone street. It's in wonderful condition. You can see it. Now, I had a lot of fun with these over the years. I put together a great show on the picture within the picture. In using these much better higher definition. I zoomed in on that little cart there, and you could actually see the faces of the children and the woman. This guy pushed it down the sidewalk and was selling things out of his cart. In the distance, that's H.O. Oats. And when I was a kid, that was a direct competitor to Mother's Oats, or Quaker Oats. They made a very creamy oatmeal. And so it was different than regular oatmeal, smoother. Some people liked it, some people didn't. But they were a big seller when I was a kid. Now, you see the Ohio turning basin. You see there this Wabash Avenue, O'Connell, Republic Streets, and then you see these Hudson River, New York and Hudson River Railroad. Eventually, they would all be joined in as later on. Freight, passenger railways taking over freight. And that's what they did. But the Ohio Basin was where they stored all of the canal boats so they could work on the canal and the harbor, rebuilding it from the storms and the washing of the water. The only thing that exists in this picture today, that little blue outlet, is the little fishing outlet on Ohio Street. It's a little park, Okay, what happened to the Ohio Basin? In my lifetime, they filled it all in. There were canal boats buried in there and I think 2 tugboats. They cut the superstructure off the tugboats and just filled it in. If you go there today, it's a baseball field and a park. Yeah, it was all rehab. But at this point in time, this was the Ohio turning basin. There was another canal coming from the top. And people don't realize this, when you open one canal, everybody wants to open another one, so they can get businesses along it. There were several other canals, and the main Hamburg Canal was one. It was never a commercial success, so it literally became a sewer. So they filled it in and sold the land off, so that you don't see the northern part of that. Now, this is the street my father was born on, Catherine Street. You see that? They got sewers running down through the middle. See that? Cutting out. Boy, the women loved that. This was 1910, and they were still using outhouses. And they put a sewer down there. They thought it was, we're going to heaven, absolutely to heaven. You're going to pave the streets. There's all the cobblestones. You can see them. And that's Elk Street up there, later South Park, up there in the distance. The dust and the dirt and the filth is going to be gone. Paved streets, the rain washes it into the storm sewer takes it away. Of course, unfortunately, the water would take it back in and feed it back to your house. Now, this is one I really like to talk about because it is the immigrant experience. Many Irish have very big families, as did the Germans, the reason why children were gainfully employed. If you start to do genealogical studies, you're going to be looking at things that are going to puzzle you and say, how could a 6-year-old be working in a factory? They were. And they were working the same schedule as the adults. 12 hours a day, 6 on Saturday, and off on Sunday. When I blew this up and showed the detail, the foreman standing there with his suit on and his derby hat. Those children are not playing. They are working for the contractor, paving the street with cobblestones. The one, when you blow it up, looks to be no more than 10. The other one probably 12, maybe 11, 12. And they were working those kinds of hours. You know how heavy a cobblestone is? 40 to 50 pounds. And of course, you see that little structure there in the middle? Well, they had to go to the bathroom somewhere and they're working on it. That was a toilet. But once they got finished, this was like, oh my God, yeah, this was ideal. They didn't quite have electricity down there yet. That'll come later. Now, continuing the migration, coming out of that area at the south and east end of First Ward, especially when you get to Smith Street, that's where it ended. This is Catherine Street. Look at that big structure in the back there, big round structure. That's an illuminating gas facility that fed gas to the whole First Ward. Because they were putting the new bridge and viaduct in, they had to raise that area, fill it in with the crane, and of course, they got it up there so it was nice and level, and then, the vehicles and horse-drawn carts mostly could get back on the street very easily. Eventually, that was torn down and went into the World War II scrap drives. Here's an interesting picture taken down there also. And this is a New York Central engine down inside the grain mill. And you can see it's coal fired. You see the old fella there on the right with the flag in his hand? That's my great-great-grandfather. He was a signalman for the New York Central. When he got, removed from that because of his age, he was 83. He went to work digging ditches. No Social Security, folks. This is the real world. You have to go out and work. And now, if you look to the left a little bit, the guy with the vest on, the black vest and the hat to one side, that's his son, William Jr. And all of these little girls here, they're all part of the Mullen Maloney family. They're all related to me. I knew I'd get some family pictures in there somewhere. This was the school that they first went to after the wooden schools were condemned. And they literally were condemned. They were horrible. So this building was torn down in 1890s because it was already obsolete. And this is what replaced it. So how did the education and that come about? In 1850, John Tynan was appointed the first bishop of Buffalo. They created a new diocese. And he wanted at least some children in the immigrant families to get an education, because he knew that there were changes coming. He started the first Catholic school down there, but he didn't last long. They moved him on to bigger things. And Stephen Ryan took over. He was the longest serving bishop ever in the history of the Catholic diocese. And he built literally dozens of schools, churches, and rectories. And he walked those streets to every single house. And he said, just give me one of your children. Give me one. You got 9, give me one. I will educate that child, and he'll be so happy at what he can do. Now remember, I did say girls.
Yeah.
They weren't considered citizens, I guess. So he did, they did. And of course, in the 1870s, again, a big era of change. We had fire companies and we had police companies. You notice I said police companies, because you had private independent police companies that would take care of you if you subscribed to them. If you got called down to your house, they got called down to your house, and you had a little plaque on your door, they would come in and take care of your problem. The same thing with the fire companies. There were private fire companies. And many times they would race to the fire to beat the other private company there, causing all kinds of accidents. Didn't matter, run people over, don't stop, get to the fire. And when they got there, they would say to the guy, you want that house to burn? No, pay me so much money. Or promise me so much money, or we're going. We're gonna let her burn to the ground. There was enough people there that said, you gotta stop this. That's when the municipal fire companies and the municipal police companies were formed. You know how many of those educated, and I'm talking 8th grade, that was a lot of schooling, got the jobs as policemen and firemen? A lot of them. And it was so much that the Germans said, what about us too? We want German-speaking policemen. And they got them. Because remember, this was a German-speaking community. The utility bills, if you look at them today, I do have examples of them in my house. My wife is gonna burn them when they die. It's all written in German. It's written in English and German. Not Spanish and English, English and German. Remember, this was a German city. So all those kids going to school, and there were girls, finally, they felt that that was necessary. And this one was on Sandusky at Hamburg Street, another school. They were very prolific people, and they created a lot of babies. And of course, the babies ended up going to school. And this was St. Stephen's Church and Rectory and Convent. This was the model that Ryan came up with. And he said that I gotta have nuns, I gotta have a school, and I gotta have a church. And all 3 of them, because we want them to have a Catholic Christian education, and we want to make opportunities for them. And of course, we gotta have a parish rectory where we can house the priests. There was no more 1 mass on Sunday. You had 2, 3, 4, 5 masses. Remember, the guys who are working shift work and things like that. So if they wanted to meet their religious obligation, they would have to go to a later mass. And so this is the model that he came up with. And of course, that's the old church. It was changed later on. Now, did they have recreation down there? Yeah, they did. The Irish were very competitive people, and they did get a day and a half off. And you can bet that the ball, you could hear it being hit with a bat. And of course, they were horse racing in the streets, and that was illegal, but they did it anyway. And this was the Travelers baseball team. And they all lived in Uniontown. And I do have the names of all of those. I don't remember all of them. But 3 of them then went up to play baseball in the National Baseball League. How do I know that? The guy up here, second from left, the back row, is my grandfather. He went, and his 2 brothers-in-law, those 2 guys on the right there, and they also were the Conley brothers. And they played for Providence, Rhode Island. They used to have a team in the National League. Now, I'm talking 1890s, okay? My grandfather played there a year and said, I got a growing family, I can't play baseball. I'm not making enough money. So he came back to Buffalo. The boy in holding that trophy at the bottom was Harry Manning. He was a commissioner of fire in Buffalo, probably back in the 30s, I think. You know, big family of them from the war, Mannings. Okay, Swanee House. How many have been in Swanee House? Okay, good food, good beer, right? Well, it was there a long, long time. Now, how did an Irishman get a chance to own a bar? On wages? No. No. You're not gonna buy a building or even lease a building and build a bar in there on the wages that an average man pays. The Germans, being very enterprising, aren't Germans. They came up with the idea, because they were the ones making beer. It was a German drink. Irishmen did not drink beer. If you go in the 1870s and hear about a riot in a saloon, it wasn't a beer drinking saloon. It was a whiskey drinking saloon. They were raised on it. They had no beer in Ireland. They were raised on whiskey, and that's what they brought with them. So how would a Swanee House get started? The German businessmen would visit the bars and look for somebody that was, first of all, sober. Secondly, they seemed to have their wits about them. And they would say, why don't you get your own bar? Yeah, right. Where am I gonna get the money to own a bar? We will loan you the money for the bar. We will stock it with booze, and you will pay us rent. And you will sell beer. And you will sell more beer than whiskey. So it's up to you to convince your friends to drink beer. Now, you know, they give you a shot of whiskey, it's about that big, you know, not very much. And you gotta pay so much money for it. And then you get a second one, and by the third one, you know, you're thinking, if I get 4, and I'll never make the door, and so I miss work and I'll get fired. So here you had this new substance that the Germans were drinking, who, by the way, in the mid 1850s, when they hit the mayor's office and most of what was then the common council, they had a law, it's on the books, folks, look, that passed a civic ordinance and said beer is a non-intoxicating beverage. Our children drink it. They have it for lunch and dinner. They're not drunks. So, pretty much was accepted by the folks of the day that beer was a non-intoxicating beverage. But here's the difference. Go in a bar in an Irish neighborhood, they're gonna give you a little drink like this, or you're gonna get a big mug of beer. Wow, that's pretty pleasant. And you get a second big mug of beer. And you're not as looped as you were on the whiskey. Hey, that's not bad. All of a sudden, beer became the drink of choice. The reason they were able to do this is because enterprising brewers said, you open a Swanee House and we want to put Lane's beer in there. we don't wanna see any other kind of beer in there, and you did that. And the guys from Iroquois Brewery said, we'll put you in a bar, we already got a building, we need somebody to run it. And if you put Iroquois beer in there, we'll do that. And Lane did the same thing, and all the other ones. I mean, oh, yeah, yeah, so every one of them, every one of them did this, all the breweries did it. That's how people got to have bars. Because they were subsidized. Twenty House is still there. That building's gone on the right, the building behind is gone. I mean, Buffalo's disappeared. This is kind of a really rare picture, there's two pictures in this period. This is the Great Lakes Transit Company warehouse on the left. And you'll see O'Neill's down there, we'll see that in a minute. And you see a bunch of cars from the thirties. And we know the date because it's on the picture, October 25th, 1938. And down on the right, you can see a crowd of men. What was going on? They were strikers. They were striking the warehouse. Now, I'll say a little bit about labor unions because the Irish were a firm believer in them. They joined them, they ran them, and they utilized them to get better working conditions, to get more money when they felt it was fair. This is what was happening there. Now, when you get to the 1930s, during this period, you would have seen 20s and 30s, virtually nobody coming out of Ireland. You remember they had a bloody civil war, they had a bloody rebellion, a lot of young men died. And so the landlords were getting the idea that we better do something because now there's an Irish government in place. And oh, by the way, it's not affiliated with Great Britain. And they're gonna come after us. So they began voluntarily giving up their land by buying it. And the government even found a way to loan money to do it. You know, like the FHA loans and all that we had in the 1950s, sir. The GIs come back, what do they need? They wanted a house, FHA mortgage, or VA mortgage. So here you are in Chicago Street in the 1930s during the Depression. Everybody's out of work. Everybody. So there were make work projects. This was a WPA project. And they were working on storm sewer program. You had to go to work, that's what you did. Some people in the room might know where this street is. This is the corner of Kingston and Seneca. And the Swan Leaders, you remember them? Nick?
I don't know if I remember that.
She's 20 years younger than me, that's why.
You know what, I do remember where the sidewalk.
The wooden sidewalks? Yeah. Yeah. So this is what it was like, and of course, there was a sewer right at the corner there that they had to rebuild. Now, all of what we've been talking about earlier, other than overseas stuff, was inside the DL&W Railroad that came up through South Buffalo and turned. And what you see is, in this picture, New York State Steel. And somebody's gonna look at me and say, you're out of your mind, that's Republic Steel. Well, it is. It was New York State Steel to begin with. And when they dredged the river out, by this time it was over your head because then you could get the big oarboats up there. You had a tugboat to pull them. Now you see it in Republic Steel Corporation, and this done in December 1946. This is the only one of those pictures that's in existence. Because my father-in-law took it. He was the head of security for Republic Steel. And he, for wartime things, he had to periodically take aerial photographs of that area. But when you look at what's outside of Republic Steel, and you look at South Park, there's hardly any houses. There's still farms there. There were still farms in that area. But of course, the Irish were breeding, the Germans were breeding, they needed a place to go for their kids. So they began to develop that. Standard Oil Company was here. The oldest people would remember the refractory that was there. At the top of it, there was always a perpetual flame. It was on the remainder of L Street. And you would see that. You'd say, oh, there's the flame. Well, They decided eventually to move to New Jersey and they took all their people with them. Closed the plant here, we were left with a brownfield to clean up. Now, Lee Street up on upper right, left, or on the right, you see Lee Street? That was the Shokoff aniline dye power plant. The power plant on, right in the middle, and then all the manufacturing. Where they had food dyes and clothing dyes, particularly the blue denim, that's what was made, right there. Now, eventually, it would end up as Buffalo Color. And that closed in the 1970s, and they just walked away from it. So that's also a brownfield. And I know about that because we built a museum on it. I don't know what this one is. I know it's Stevenson Street. It's Stevenson, yeah, Stevenson Street. Yeah. Yeah, and these were newly built. In the late 1920s, there was Burke Builders and there was a couple other builders that built homes on spec. And this was a risky thing to do, but it was, and you gotta remember, it was boom times in the late 20s. And so, it'd be $1 down and $1 a week, to buy a house. And so they began to go out into the wasteland of what we call South Buffalo today, near Mercy Hospital and that. And all those streets were just farm fields. They began dividing them up and began building houses. Now you notice they're all 2 or 3 story houses. The model was, the Germans had taught the Irishers, you get the ground floor, the tenant gets the next floor up, and anybody else you don't like goes in the top floor. That's how you paid your mortgage. Was there anybody coming in here in the 1930s? Why would you come from Ireland in the 1930s? There's a depression now. It was a worldwide depression. In a few years, though, that would change. This is the Washburn Crosby plant, and we had talked about it already, but this is the form it had when this was taken in 1925. That eventually became General Mills, and that remained General Mills to this day. Yeah, and of course, these other small buildings at the right, that was the railroad yardmaster's office, and the various different things to control it. That was a signalman's one, and small that right near the tracks there. And that was to protect the children. And here we have W.T. Rourke. I never identified where this picture was taken, but I want to show it to you just because if you look closely at the workmen, got shovels on their shoulder and stuff like that, got a top coat on, a fedora hat, and they got ties on. You left the house looking like that at 6 o'clock in the morning, you walked to the job, you got paid $8 a week to work on this, and that's what fed your family, or kept a wolf away from the door. And you didn't pay a mortgage payment, you paid on the interest, because that's all you could afford, and many times not that. What was it like for somebody like that? I could be looking at my grandfather, or somebody's uncle, or dad. They walked out the door looking like a businessman, and this is what they had to do. It was tough times, really tough. And I don't imagine those top coats in that were warm enough. This guy's got one that looks warmer. This is all that's left of Uniontown. That's the tractor trailer train. Now, I'm summing all this up. We talked about famine somewhat. Yeah, I told you first off, there was 38 major famines in Ireland. 3 big ones, one in 1340, another one in 1460, and then a couple of more in the early part, 1814, 18. And of course, in 1814, generally the whole world's temperatures plummeted because of a volcano that blew up over in Indonesia, Krakatoa. And so we had whole years with all winter, no summer. And it was horrible because people all over the world were suffering from that. And when you talk about how famines happen, there were still famines in Ireland in 1925. Almost all of the bad famines happened mostly in the western part of Ireland, the poorest, the most separated from the cities. But that was the same in Germany, same in Poland. All of the peasants in those countries, and I don't like to call them peasants, they're just folks. That lived in the southern part of those countries, they lived on a potato, much like the Irish did. The difference with the Irish was, you had to somehow get to a port with enough money in your hand to buy passage, so you could go to another life. The German princes paid their way to get rid of them, because the farming model there was changing to herding. People were starting to eat more meat. They weren't eating the cereal bread, they did, but they weren't eating as much. And so that happened in Germany. Poland, which had been the most punished nation in the world, it was on a flat level plain, and the Cossacks came through there, Attila the Hun came through there, the Russians came through there, anybody else they came through there. But the Poles in southern Poland, they had the same dependency on the potato that the Irish did. What was the difference? The Tsar didn't want them there anymore. So he paid for their passage. If you could get up to Gdansk, you could get on a ship and you could go to America. Now, what did that bode for the Irish? This Germans started coming here in 1850. In 1870, there was a huge number of Germans coming here, escaping the foolish wars in Europe, until Bismarck decided to unite all of the princely states like Prussia, Württemberg, and all that into a nation called Germany. And that's what happened. In Italy, Garibaldi did the same thing. People from Sardinia, down in the south, or wherever, you went, Rome. In Italy, if some prince in Italy, and there were tons of them, if he decided to be mad at the neighbor, he went to war. And so what happened? They just said, enough of this, I'm going somewhere. Did they all come here? No. Want to see a lot of Irishmen? Go to Montserrat. It's an Irish island. Most of them are dark skinned, but it's an Irish island. Go to Brazil. You want to see a lot of, let's say, Germans? South America is loaded with them. When I worked down in Colombia and Peru, there were all kinds of them there. German clubs. You walk in there and everybody be speaking German, and as soon as they walked in, they stopped talking. And whoever you work with, they go like this. Who are they? What do they want? They're working here. You tell them in German. And then he'd say, they're not spies, they're none of that. They're just working here. And then you'd see the one old guy in the back, he'd say, let them eat and get out and never come back. We decided to leave anyway. But these are where these people were settling. Now, if you were a part of the laboring class in Buffalo, and you got a whole bunch of people coming in from Poland and Italy, and they're moving into your neighborhood, what are you gonna do? You flee. How did South Buffalo out here get the way it was today? It's because those people's families started in the war, most of them, and they moved out. The people in the 8th Ward in the Alcohol Canal side, they were mostly Italians. And actually, they didn't consider themselves Italians. They did not. They were Sardinians. They didn't care. People, you know, but they would come in and work for half of the wages or less just to get a job. They didn't care where they lived. If you ever get a chance to read a good book, and this is a commercial, this has been on the bestseller list for 20-some years. It's a book we wrote about what they now call Canal Side. There. One of the buildings down there was called by the Italians the Palazzo Porcino, the Palace of Pigs. Why did they do that? It was built as a Riviera hotel. Then it became an immigrant hotel. My great grandmother She was from Tipperary. Her name was Alicia Hogan. That's where she moved, in there with her mother. She came on the ship by herself when she was 12 years old. They had a note pinned to her collar where she was to go in Buffalo. Other immigrants evidently coming into Buffalo took her under her wing, and when she got to Buffalo, there was somebody waiting for her. They were leaving Ireland in numbers, but here's the thing. They didn't have the competition for the jobs then that they had later on, particularly in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, because you not only had Poles and Germans, Italians, you had Lithuanians, Carpathians, folks you don't even know exist, Ruthenians. They were real people. They were Slovak peoples that were coming here in huge numbers. They would walk in there with a gang of 6 men and say, "How much your wages?" "Well, these guys are getting 70 cents a day. We'll do it for 25. And did it get ugly? Yes, it got ugly. But eventually, there was enough industry that Buffalo was able to hold its own. Lastly, what you look at is the fact that in 1950, there was a big immigration from Ireland to Western New York. But you probably don't have a clue, do you? The big power project. The big power project up in Niagara Falls. Thousands of men came here and worked. Those were the guys that I got to know because I was working with them. Because after the big jobs started to wind down, they grabbed the jobs at all of the utility companies and things like that. When I went to work for Iroquois Gas, it was one of those things where half of the people in there were immigrants, and mostly Irish. 5 or 6 of the guys that I worked with, and I know you're gonna find this hard to believe, but they talked me into going down to a bar. And they did, and we had a few drinks, and next thing you know, one guy stood up and gave a big speech about he was gonna build we're gonna buy an Irish center. I need $100 from every one of you guys. Yeah, all right, you're $100. Let's go get an Irish center. It was Patty Burns. And it's not his real first name, but we always call him Patty Burns. Anyway, they put this group together, and Charlie Traynor, I showed you early on, became the president of 26 organizations of Irish descent, and they raised the money. They had big dances, they had big name Irish acts come, to what the hell is that one out on Harlem Road? I can't remember. They had big dances there. They had the Irish Rovers, and they had Clancy Brothers, and all of these big, well-known bands. And they would have big dances to raise money for the Irish Center, and eventually it opened. Well, the 5 guys or 6 guys that I worked with, they were part of the charter member. I was one also. But what they wanted to do was to bring the similar type of culture that they had with the Irish dancing, Ceilidh dancing, not like you see the step dancing on TV. This is folk dancing, looks like square dancing, Ceilidh dancing, and they still do it. They folks meet there. I dance with her, so I know. She was there, and see, my cousin Mickey's here, but the only dancing I did was her jitterbugs. But anyway, it's now celebrating 50 years or something like that. 53 years. So I guess with that, you can say it was quite an odyssey for immigration. It wasn't what we say they all got on a boat and went to Ellis Island. They all seemed to have a purpose in mind to come here. Didn't want to live in New York City, there were too many people. Came to Buffalo and they found like-minded people like them, and people that would give them an opportunity. Say, look, I can help you out and get you a job. Just get started, live in the basement until you get yourself on your feet. And here we are today. With that.
We're going in there. have any questions or comments for Ed, I invite you to stay behind. We can have that conversation. Otherwise, I hope you'll join us on April 22nd when we'll be inviting Dwayne Junt, who will be talking about Theodore Roosevelt as our bird watcher in chief. Teddy Roosevelt and America's Birds, April 22nd. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night. Drive safe.